In August of this year, shortly after the airing of Book 2, Owen Dennis's Infinity Train released its third book, called The Conductor, on HBO Max. After thoroughly enjoying the first book, enjoying the second book even more, I have little doubt this book will be great. In this video, just like last time, I'll be going through each episode, giving it a score, and then talking about the season in general at the end. Also, now that we are at the end of the series at this point, spoilers for the entire show. Without any further ado, every episode of Infinity Train, Book 3, reviewed. Episode 1, The Musical Car. The kids of the Apex raid a musical car before descending on a village of unsuspecting turtles, but before they can complete their mission, leaders Grace and Simon are separated from the pack under mysterious circumstances. The opening song and scene do a great job in showing how the Apex are doing, and more specifically, how Grace and Simon are doing. I'll talk more about it later, but the choice of focusing on the Apex in this season was a great decision. Anyway, the song is pretty good, a lot of parallels between what's about to happen to Simon and Grace. The shift between the joyful musical and the dark Apex music was a great transition between the two sides of the Apex, the happy group of kids and the murder is okay. Knowing what the audience knows, that denizens or gnolls are actual beings with souls, the beginning of this episode gets a whole lot darker, with children murdering and kidnapping people. The aesthetic of the stage burning down as Simon and Grace begin to show how close they are is fantastic for the mood of the scene. Grace actually showing that she's kind to those that she believes are real humanizes her a little bit from the Grace of last season. Getting to see the unfinished car again was neat, although I'd imagine it did limit the amount of damage they could show these kids is doing. It's hard to convince CN censors to let you show children murdering corgis. I know I said this last season too, but the action has taken a huge step up. With Simon's gravity boots and the Apex's willingness to kill, the fight scenes are great to watch. This episode does have its problems though. The first half and second half feel very disconnected, the Kevin joke is run to the ground again, and the setup feels a bit too forced. Still a great beginning that sets up the story of the book well, even if it is a bit messy. Episode 2, The Jungle Car. Grace and Simon look on the bright side and hope this will be a mini vacation from their responsibilities as leaders of the Apex. This episode has one of the best designs of a car in the entire series. While nothing too creative, this episode does allow for a typical forest setting with great backgrounds. Up until you meet Tuba and Hazel, about 6 minutes in, the episode is relatively boring, but that's not entirely a bad thing. The episode really begins to flesh out Simon and Grace's relationship, and since we only have an episode and a half before the other two main characters from the poster join, it makes sense that we need to slow things down for a little bit. This part of the episode isn't fantastic, but the scene where Simon and Grace talk about Simon needing to loosen up and the montage of them exploring the car was pretty fun to watch. Having older main characters is already starting to pay off for the show. Getting to Hazel and Tuba, this scene is well written. Simon and Grace portray the two sides of a coin in this episode, with Simon being the rougher, more frightening part, and Grace being the kind and welcoming part. Hazel's portrayal of a typical 6-year-old girl is pretty good, but Grace's manipulating ways of getting Hazel to travel with them back to the Apex shows her manipulating tendencies from last book have returned. I'll talk about Tuba more later, since her main purpose isn't for a few more episodes. A pretty decent episode, but a little lacking in action or emotional moments. Episode 3, The Debutante Car. The gang's uneasy alliance is tested by a challenge in their first car together, dancing in a high-stakes octopus debutante ball. The actual car itself and the concept is perfect for the story this episode is trying to tell. They use this car very well by using the dance setting to set up Grace's life before the train naturally and to give one of the first hints towards Hazel's identity. Hazel's reaction to the questioning about her past does a great job in setting up that Hazel isn't hiding her past or anything, she just really doesn't know. Simon and Grace's dance is nice and all, but it holds the same purpose as their montage in the last episode. The show is trying very hard to show how close Simon and Grace are before ripping them apart, but at this point we kinda already understand. Also, we really don't need to see them dance twice, even if the second time is relatively short. At least that section allowed for some jokes from the audience. Again, the backgrounds for this episode are really good. This season easily has the biggest jump in visual quality of the series so far. The ending of this episode is easily the best part. Hazel becoming a member of the Apex is a turning point for her, as she is officially tied to Grace and Simon. The scene on the bridge is great too. The usually socially inept Simon learning Hazel's song in an attempt to make the relationship between her and Tuba less special is a great moment for Simon's character, as he starts to learn from Grace's manipulating ways. Grace and Tuba sharing an awkward glance as Grace's number goes down from knowing what they're about to do to Tuba and feeling bad about it is the first real step in her redemption arc. Overall, a nice episode and the calm before the storm. Episode 4, Le Chat Chalet Car. Stuck in a blizzard, the gang seeks shelter in a nearby cabin, but when Simon realizes who's inside, he frantically searches for a way out. The snowball fight at the beginning of this episode, a nice fun breather before the heavy episode, leads expertly into Grace's realization of her number going down. Grace's fear that her being shown as weak makes her a worse leader is a short-lived problem of hers, but it's one that is portrayed fairly well in the 1 or 2 scenes it's in. The reveal of the history between Simon and the cat is led up to expertly and is built up steadily throughout the episode. Speaking of the cat, this is easily her best episode in the show so far. She really gains a new dimension in this episode, as Simon is the first person we've seen her really care about. Simon's immense distrust and dislike of the cat shows how hurt he really is, despite his apparent belief that gnolls aren't real. Grace and Simon have their first real argument in this episode, as Simon starts to believe that Grace is hiding something. The scene in the collection room, with Simon being afraid of the Gome, is some excellent foreshadowing of a few things, one of those being his backstory with the cat. The cat now defending herself and really just starting to act sorrowful for the first time when Simon calls her out is really powerful, especially if you remember her telling Tulip all the way back in book 1 that she always does the right thing. Both the writing and Simon's voice actor are great throughout the entire season, especially in this episode. You can really feel the pain in his voice. The conversation on the stairs is nice too, not much to say about it. The whole Randall thing is fine, I guess, but the real part I want to talk about is the final scene. Simon, in a moment of understanding, says a goodbye to the cat while a softer version of her leitmotif plays. The pause before Simon addresses her, despite just being a second, is so telling of how much pain her abandonment of him caused. And I'm glad we get to see the cat again this season, but even if this was her last moment, the relationship between her and Simon is easily one of the best parts of the book. Despite having some questionable plot involvement of Randall, this is the first truly great episode of the season. Episode 5, The Color Clock Car. A giant color-changing clock creates a shift maze puzzle that the gang has to solve before they can leave the car. This episode is a very similar vibe to the ball pit car from season 1. The episode seems all happy until it isn't. I didn't like the conversation between Grace and Hazel while they were climbing the pyramid. It's short-lived and just shows that Grace is back to completely hating gnolls again for about an episode, and that Hazel is temporarily too dumb to understand that Grace is saying that Tuba isn't a real being. Simon and Tuba's, on the other hand, is actually quite good. This episode makes you think that Simon is realizing the similarities between him and Tuba. The whole point of this episode being the importance of teamwork is a bit too on the nose in contrast to the ending, but I'll get to it later. The actual setting of the car isn't too exciting. Roy's bit is simple but drags on for too long, and the actual puzzle is convenient at best and random at worst. But similar to the ball pit car, this is all just a facade for the ending of the episode. The ending is multifaceted. Simon taunting Tuba before kicking him to the wheels is perhaps the darkest moment in what can somewhat be considered a kid's cartoon. But even darker is Simon just telling Hazel that he killed her and acting proud of it. Simon could have just said that he couldn't save her, but he chose to tell Hazel that he willed her. This is the point of no return for Simon, as he completely stops even trying to not be psychopathic. While Tuba did have a few death flags in the beginning of this episode, her death marks the beginning of the dark half of the season. Hazel's transformation is just shocking, but doesn't really mean much yet. The show's goofy turtle joke threatens to ruin the moment, though. While this episode isn't as good as the ball pit car, mainly due to the transformation being nothing more than shocking and the less than ideal conversation between Hazel and Grace, it's still great and sets up the second half of the book. Episode 6, The Campfire Car. The Apex are just a car away. They're almost home, but first they have to make it through a forest of pinecone camp counselors. Grace's constellation of Hazel, both for her transformation and the loss of Tuba at the beginning of this episode, is overshadowed by the funeral scene at the end of the episode. It's not terrible, but Hazel seems to get over it relatively quickly for the time being. Grace snapping at Simon and pulling rank on him marks the beginning of the downfall of their relationship. The funeral goes on for about 5 minutes, and despite the lack of action, it's one of the best scenes in the show. Hazel making Grace realize how much Tuba meant to her and how Grace is partially responsible for the death is heartbreaking for Grace, as she starts to realize her destructive habits might be wrong. And the song just hits you like a train, no pun intended. Hazel's voice actor does a great job the entire season, but this part in particular, with her singing the lullaby as the show pans around the forest, is tragic. And while the show does sometimes revert to its less than ideal animation, when it wants to look great, it looks fantastic. This whole scene is beautiful, both writing and visually, and Grace breaking down afterwards finishes the great moment. Simon pretending to be nice to Hazel right after mentioning how she'll stop being a burden once she assimilates is sociopathic. His wank after patting her on the head makes the watcher viscerally upset. Again, the reveal at the end of this episode isn't much on its own, but I'll get to it more in the next episode. While parts of this episode might have been a little boring, like them looking for a place to have the funeral, any episode with said funeral would easily get a perfect score. Episode 7, The Canyon of the Golden Winged Snakes Car. The gang finds themselves in a car full of golden winged snakes, but in that dusty landscape, a mystery they're unprepared for awaits them. The first 4 minutes until they get into the cave are easily the weakest part of the episode. Amelia is a bit too confrontational, and considering that she's supposed to be better for, is definitely withholding information for seemingly no reason. Her speech is a little long-winded and filled with a lot of unnecessary jokes. Her character is somehow too serious and too comical, and it's really frustrating how she went from the main villain to just a walking joke box for 4 minutes. But the last 8 minutes of this episode are so fantastic that you forget about what happened. The fight between Grace and Simon is fantastically written. Despite the recent events making you hate Simon, this episode makes you feel so bad for him. Grace lashes out at him and he just takes it. Hazel's breakdown is nice too. I'm glad that she still harbors resentment for Simon after what he did to Tuba just 2 episodes ago. The scene of Simon traveling back to the cat's cabin has some sick music and looks really good. But then we get to the best part of the episode, Simon's last conversation with the cat. In all other circumstances with the cat, she's always full of herself and only looks out for herself. However, when it comes to Simon, while there's definitely still a little bit of that, she truly cares about him. As I said before, Simon's breakdown makes you feel bad for somebody who we've come to learn is a terrible person. He even uses the cat's real name, Samantha, something he hasn't done yet in an effort to distance himself. This is definitely the cat's best episode, as she tries desperately to keep Simon from learning something he doesn't want to know. The cat wouldn't help somebody for free if she didn't care about them. Her saying that Simon has no idea what he's getting himself into leaves the whole episode on a somber note, as Simon doesn't even say goodbye to Samantha. I mulled over what to give this episode since the last 8 minutes were so great, but I couldn't in good conscience give it a perfect score when I only liked 2/3 of it. Still a great episode though. Episode 8, The Hey-Ho-Whoa Car. In the seemingly innocent Hey-Ho-Whoa Car, a shocking revelation rocks Grace and Simon's world. Will they be able to fix it before the Apex find out? Despite breaking the pattern of the 8th episode in the season being something tragic happening, this episode still has some big moments for Grace and Simon. Learning the idol they have been worshipping for 7 years was a complete lie the entire time shakes the worlds of both Simon and Grace, but the reaction of both of them to the news is telling of the journeys they have gone on this season. Grace is understanding and somewhat willing to change, but Simon is completely unwilling to even listen and is angry. Despite Grace actually being there and Simon just hearing the stories of the true conductor from Grace, he is much less willing to change his ways. I'll talk about the shifts between Grace and Simon more in my season overview, but the season-long arcs of all 3 main characters are incredibly satisfying. This leads to the discovery of Hazel being a semi-clone of Ulrich. The clues have been there from the beginning, like Hazel using British slang, but it was still practically unknowable until this episode. Grace lashing out at Hazel in front of Simon is heartbreaking for Hazel, as I think this is a moment where Hazel decides she can no longer travel with Grace. Simon going behind Grace's back to go into her tape and discovering that she was keeping the truth about Hazel hidden this whole time is the straw that broke the camel's back for Simon. Ever since he killed Tuba, he has seemed unredeemable, but in this moment, he loses the last thing he had. Grace. This episode is just filled with moment after moment of betrayal, and at the end, everyone is different for the worse. Great episode that ruins any chance of this season having a happy ending, which for a show like this is a great thing. Episode 9, The Origami Car. The gang is finally ready to meet the Apex again, but keeping secrets has consequences. Grace trying to desperately keep Hazel from leaving her starts this episode off with a feeling of dread. Amelia is by no stretch of the imagination a motherly figure, so the fact that Hazel wanted to go with her instead of Grace just shows how betrayed Hazel feels. Hazel lost Tuba, and now she's lost Grace too. Hazel leaving the gang in a penultimate episode leaves the characters and the show in general in such a dark place. Hazel leaving without any kind of resolution, as far as we and Grace know, is just another thing in the list of awful things this season has put our characters through. Simon ends up trapping Grace in her own memories while he tortures her, and it's arguably the darkest thing Simon has done. Just like watching Tulip go through her tape, Grace's tape was an emotional roller coaster, if the roller coaster was on fire. Watching her be left alone by her family and friends explains why this entire season she's just been trying to avoid being alone. I'll talk about it more in my season overview, but man, this whole season is really just a tragedy. We also get to see a few memories on the train. Simon seeing the conductor as no more than how she really was leaves him so stunned as he refuses to accept that it happened. Him explaining how everyone lied to him is done so well, it made me feel bad for him, despite all the horrific things that he's done.
Cat lied to me, and you lied to me. Everyone lies to me!
Simon's betrayal by the cat isn't nearly as bad as Simon says it was. As Samantha said, she didn't leave him, she ran. Then we see Simon next to Grace, towering above her, leaving her to rewatch her own memories for the rest of time, with numbers now up to his neck. Simon shoving Grace to the ground and leaving her there is such a powerful ending to a great episode. Generally, before I give a rating to an episode, I list things I disliked about it, but this time, I really can't think of any. Episode 10, The New Apex. The gang reorders the Apex, but what will the new order be? Going into this episode, I was worried about how they could possibly pace this episode to get from where we were to a good ending. I shouldn't have. Grace's confrontation with Hazel, who is really just Grace's subconscious, is perhaps the most this show has ever done with just the opening 2 minutes of an episode. Hazel confronts Grace on everything she's ever done, her indirect and direct killing of hundreds of denizens, including Tuba, and how she lied to everyone to try to keep from being alone. This scene is incredible, from the culmination of her journey to the intense imagery to the great voice acting of Hazel and Grace to the great visuals to the sick music. This scene is just so good, and moments like this are what make great shows great. Afterwards, we get the closest thing this show will ever do to body horror. Seriously though, Grace saving all the origami birds that Simon crushed is an emotional scene where Grace has finally realized the error of her ways and has come out better on the other side. Simon, on the other hand, hasn't. He creates a label for Grace, Void, just like she did for Knowles, and it's a perfect example of how a label can make you stop considering a person, and treat them more like a thing. In an attempt to make himself feel better for what Grace did to him, Simon made her less than him. He doesn't listen to anything she says, and their argument turns into a fist fight. This fight is great and fun to watch. Grace telling Simon that she won't apologize just to avoid being alone is just more proof that she's changed, and Simon refusing to back off is more proof that he hasn't. Simon kicking Grace to the wheels despite her saving him is incredibly shocking. When it happened, I had to pause and just stare at the screen. Even though she doesn't die, Simon doing that is incredibly evil and horrifying, and this completes his transformation to a complete monster. The thing this season will be most remembered for, however, is Simon's death. Watching Simon squirm and cry as a gome disintegrates him is haunting. As much as Simon might have deserved it, it doesn't make it any less tragic. Grace's speech and disbanding of the Apex leaves the season on a somewhat hopeful note. A lot of what I have to say about this episode leads into the season overview, but before I get to that, the finale is the hardest part of a show to pull off. And for a season as challenging as this one and nail it almost perfectly, the only problem I have with it being the somewhat random origami bird saving Grace, is an achievement worth celebrating. Season overview time. This season is a doozy, so apologies if this is a bit long. In order to save some time, I'll quickly run through some of the smaller things. This is easily the best season visually. Some scenes just look fantastic. Also, the music is better than it's ever been. It fits the dark mood so well. Speaking of the dark mood, this season is incredibly dark, darker than both the first season and the second season. Unlike the first two seasons, which are relatively comedic, this season is less on comedy. This is great, as this season isn't a comedy, it's a tragedy. Getting into the characters, each main character has their own arc. The cat's use is great. Her connection to Simon is a highlight of the season for sure. Tuba is more or less there just to progress others' plots, but she still has her jokes and emotional moments. Hazel is the biggest tragedy of the entire book. Unlike Grace and Simon, whose terrible decisions put them in this situation, Hazel is innocent and still has her motherly figure killed. Grace betrays her, and she learns she's not a real person. She really goes through it all, and hopefully things with Amelia goes well. Speaking of Amelia, I was really annoyed with how they handled her character in this book. She ends up just being an annoying British lady at times. But really, this whole book is about two characters, Grace and Simon. These two characters are the highlight of the season for sure. First, I'll focus on Simon. Despite starting off the season with a lower number, he's much more willing to do whatever it takes than Grace. I believe that unlike Grace, Simon knows that Knowles are real and uses uses the excuse that they aren't to justify his abuse. Otherwise, why would he be so hurt by what the cat did, and why would he taunt Tuba before killing her? He was so hurt by Noel, Samantha, that he is willing to dismiss them as people. This makes him much more evil than Grace, and due to his lack of willingness to change, his death was inevitable. His moments of emotional outbreak, like when he tells Grace that everyone lies to him, makes you feel so bad for a psychopath, and proves that the train can lead a horse to water, but can't make them drink. Grace has done everything she can in this season to prevent being alone. However, by not committing to either Simon or Hazel, she loses them both. I'm glad they made her less obnoxious even by the beginning of this season. Last book, she was unbearable at times. Her and Simon go opposite ways throughout this book, both in number and mentality. This season doesn't have an outside antagonist, but instead, Simon develops into one. This is such an interesting concept, and the show nails it. Grace's decision to end the Apex shows that she's committing to a new way. I hope that she gets her exit, but I'm glad that she ends this season still on the train. Grace and Simon are so dynamic and bounce off each other so well. The whole season was fantastic, and deserves at least a 9 out of 10. I really hope that Owen Dennis can end up getting his 8 seasons. Just quickly, my least favorite episode was the Jungle Car, and while my favorite episode was difficult to pick, as I gave 5 out of 5s, I'm gonna have to give it to the new Apex. Anyway, that's it. This has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll hopefully see you in book 4. I'll have some things in between then, though. See you then.